Welcome to the Enlightenment Podcast to our listeners and viewers all around the world. Thank you very much for joining us in these very critical times. We feel, as you know, that it is vital to engage in meaningful and perhaps slightly different discourse on Palestine than is provided by legacy media, providing some insight and some context that you might not be seeing every week or every day, while still celebrating Palestine's rich traditions and culture and history. Today, we are very excited to be joined by Ronnie Barkan to discuss Palestine, Zionism, and the quest for justice. Welcome to the Enlightenment Podcast, Ronnie.
Thank you so much for having me, Hanan and Shamim.
Let me give you a bit of background. Ronnie is a dedicated Jewish Israeli activist and co-founder of Boycott from Within. This is a group that supports BDS, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, and it comprises of Jews and Palestinians from 1948. An outspoken anti-Zionist, Ronnie describes Israel, and I quote, as a white or racial supremacist entity founded on ethnic cleansing and apartheid. Been active since he chose to be a conscientious objector in 1997, and he has been arrested multiple times for his protests. He's represented Palestinian rights at forums like the European Parliament, and Ronnie's activism is inspired by anti-apartheid activism in South Africa. More on that later. Hanan, where did we first find out about Ronnie?
Yeah, so our dear friend Sandra Watfa, who's a Palestinian artist and activist, has been talking about Ronnie for a number of years now. And we featured Sandra in a previous podcast, which I highly recommend.
So do I. Actually, let's start talking to Ronnie now. That felt like a long preamble, but we love it. So, Ronnie, your grandparents are Holocaust survivors. You grew up near Tel Aviv. You were drafted into the Israeli army, even though you weren't interested in being a soldier. It took you about a year and a half of fighting the system to get out of there. Could you share some of these experiences growing up and how your early belief in Zionism shaped your adulthood, really?
So I was asked about that quite a few times, like, how do you snap out of that type of thinking, that type of system? And I don't have a perfect answer. I can give you a few ideas. But I think that the first thing is that I like to think that I was kind of lucky, that I was not that influenced, maybe just a little bit brainwashed just on the surface of it. I was never too much of a nationalist, never patriotic, was never interested in being a soldier. But we're being trained that to be an Israeli is to be a soldier. So, and anyone who doesn't go to the army is regarded at least as a parasite, if not a traitor. Trained to be soldiers from kindergarten, and then a friend showed me this ad for a maternity ward, where you see a fetus in a womb, wearing a military beret and giving the salute, and the caption says something like a decorated soldier of, and then 18 years from now or something like that. And this is an ad for a maternity ward. So basically the idea is, come and have your baby with us because you will also have a decorated soldier in the future. Yeah. So apparently we are being trained to be soldiers even before kindergarten. And I would argue that this type of coming out of Zionism and everything that the Zionist project is about, and everything that the whole situation in Palestine is about, revolves around that type of mental issue of Israeli society, and hopefully coming out of it. Unfortunately, only a few actually do, but it is a mental issue. I mean, it is a whole mentally deranged society that we are dealing with, and for them to realize anything, it has nothing to do with the facts. It's all about coming out of something, which is a difficult thing to do. So I say, okay, I was quite lucky. It wasn't that influential on me, just kind of on the surface level. I never really wanted to be a soldier, was never too nationalistic, but still I didn't see a problem with being an Israeli. And then for 6 years, which means 3 years of high school and 3 years also of university, I was contemplating the idea of whether I'm willing to be a soldier or not. So already thinking about whether I'm willing to be a soldier or not is already a big deal for most people. And I had no one...
Was that to do with your own personal preference to be in the army, or was it to do with the politics of the world that you were in?
It's one and the same for me. So basically, I'm a humanist. Maybe even humanist is not such a a great word these days, but looking at humanity. But in general, I was never, the fact that there is a law saying that I have to be a soldier, the fact that it is expected of me doesn't mean anything. The question of whether I'm willing to go to the army or not depends on my volition, on whether I am willing to do that or not. So this is the way I was all along. So that's the other thing. One thing is that I was lucky and I don't think that I was that influenced, just a little bit. The second thing is that I just evaluate things for myself. I was never too interested in what is the expected thing to do. I don't think that I'm a rebel, just not interested in what I'm expected to do. And I definitely do not worship authority. I sit here right now in Germany, which is the place that is the most worshiping of authority that I've ever met. And I can tell you that really, I mean, another society that has serious issues is German society, because it is so obedient and so worshiping of authority. But in my case, in Israel, I was not that influenced by what I was supposed to do. I had to evaluate for myself. So I had 3 years of high school to think about it. Then I went to university because I had a chance to do that. And then I did that exactly in order to postpone the decision about whether I'm willing to be a soldier or not, because I was never too keen on being a soldier. Eventually, after 6 years of contemplating, I still couldn't convince myself. And I ended up getting drafted because I literally had no one to talk to about it. There was no one, not in school, not in the family, no one that would understand what it is that I'm going through or that I'm thinking about. And I didn't want to be a parasite or a traitor. I wanted to be the good person. So I ended up getting drafted 2 months into the army, and I didn't do anything in the army. That's a side issue. I didn't do anything in the army because I studied physics and maths. I was designated to be in charge of an anti-tank missile project in the army as someone who is a physicist. So basically all I did for the first couple of months is sit in the library and read about missiles. So it's not that I had encountered anything dramatic during my military service or no service, but I just had more time to think about it. I never thought that I would actually finish my mandatory military service to begin with, even when I got drafted. But during this little taste of the army, I had enough to spark something, to have this little eureka moment saying, okay, it's enough. The first eureka moment, the first realization was actually about another thing that I was contemplating about vegetarianism, whether I'm willing to eat animals or not. Today I'm vegan, but back then I had this realization that it's time to stop eating animals, and that I'm doing this not only for the cow, but also for myself. This is the thing that I feel most wholesome about. 1 week later, I had another realization, which was it's time to leave the army. So for me, these things are interrelated. But the moment I had this realization, I stopped being a soldier. I stopped being an Israeli. I'm a human being. I don't care about the rest. If there is anything that I can be a traitor of, is humanity. And from that moment on, I stopped being a soldier, but I was already in the system. Once you're in the system, it's much more difficult to get out. So I had to fight the system for 1.5 years. I refused to be a soldier. They refused to release me. In my case, it happened several times in my life that I had some kind of guardian angel, in a way, someone who would protect me. So the commander that I had, apparently, she was supportive of me. She tried to help me. So she never reported to her superiors that I wasn't showing up. That is how I ended up not being sent to military prison, even though I had no problem doing that, because the moment I decided that I'm no longer a soldier, that's it. I was no longer a soldier. But it so happened that I managed to find my way, and eventually, after 1.5 years of not serving, I managed to get out of that system. But psychologically, it was very difficult for me, because even though I didn't act as a soldier, I was still in that system that I loathe, that I am absolutely against.
Yeah.
That I see as a terror organization, and that is, to put it mildly. So that's kind of the story in a nutshell of coming out of that.
Well,
and ever since I was an activist, I mean, it's obvious. The moment you snap out of that, the rest is easy. There's nothing complicated about it.
Well, it takes guts, that's for sure, Ronnie. It's not now it's easy, but it's not really easy when you're in it, I'm sure. Shall we go back a little bit about just how it all started, and with Zionism being a late 19th century supremacist settler colonial ideology. And as we know, settler colonialism is an ideology of transfer, expelling, ethnic cleansing of the local indigenous population to create a new homeland versus immigrating to a new home as immigrants. So two different things. But when the Zionists started to settle historic Palestine, they were ruthless, very well coordinated, relentless, and very deliberate in their Hasbara propaganda. And you did a previous interview I listened to where you mentioned that the Zionist takeover of Palestine is not complicated. So could you please elaborate what that means, and also how a small, fanatical, what used to be a fringe movement really became now widespread and the dominant narrative in the mainstream?
Yeah. So first of all, we have to understand that Zionism was not a big success story when it was founded and up until roughly World War II. So less than 5% of European Jews supported Zionism, hardly any of the other Jews around the world, Arab Jews, in Arab countries and so on, also known as Mizrahi Jews. And actually at the same time, there were other versions, other gatherings, groups of people of Jewish descent who were active, and they were, for example, the Bund, which was a socialist workers movement. They were much more popular in Eastern Europe than Zionism. The Zionists basically, okay, we all accept that there was anti-Semitism in Europe. Not so much in the Arab world, but definitely in Europe. There was anti-Semitism for centuries. It became possibly worse at the time of Zionism. And those Zionists, they felt that they wanted to be just like any other European, along with all kinds of issues of supremacy and so on, that they felt, we are better than others, we are educated Europeans and so on. And those Zionists were treated badly by their fellow Europeans. And they were treated badly because they are coming from Jewish descent. But those Zionists hated the religious Jews of Europe. They loathed the ultra-Orthodox. They saw them as being backwards, as carrying disease. They were using the worst terminology, like rats and so on. This is the terminology used by the Zionists at the time. So one of Herzl's first ideas was, well, in order to solve what he called the Jewish problem, let us all mass convert into Christianity. Let us all go to the cathedral on a Sunday when the bells are ringing and mass convert, and problem solved.
Is that,
he didn't manage to convince.
Wow, is that actually a thing that we know about from Herzl?
He wrote it. It's in his writings. Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay.
And so that was one of his early ideas, obviously, because he really didn't want anything to do with Judaism or those religious Jews, which he really didn't like. He felt that he was better than them, but that wasn't. He wasn't able to convince his fellow Zionists of that, of converting to Christianity. So it evolved into another type of thinking that fully adopts the anti-Semitic discourse of the time, that says that basically Jews are some sort of an alien element in society that cannot be part of the rest of society, whether it is in Austria where he was living or other places, and therefore they can never be part of that society, and they need to have a place for them and only for them. And that notion of exclusivity, of having a place for us and only for us, that is at the heart of Zionism. That is at the heart of everything that the Zionist project is about. And it is at the heart of everything that is happening right now. Everything that happened since. Okay? So it's not only that they were racist and supremacist and all of that, all bad, and colonialists, of course, but also the notion of exclusivity. Now, obviously, Zionism got a lot of attention and support during World War II, when there was really no other choice for the Jews of Europe other than to seek another place, another shelter. another refuge. But the only thing is that the Zionists were the ones who blocked access for Jewish migrants, refugees, to anywhere other than to Palestine. And it happened before, during, and after the Holocaust, that the Zionists were the ones who were actually blocking access for Jewish refugees from anywhere other than going to Palestine. And we can talk more about that. So this is kind of in a nutshell about what happened with Zionism. But the Zionists from the get-go, again in Herzl's writing, he said that he knew that the anti-Semites would be their closest allies. And you see to this day how the anti-Semites and the fascists and the supremacists and all the rest are Israel's closest allies. What we are seeing these days is clearly an act of fascists of the world unite. Yeah. Hopefully, we'll also have the anti-fascists of the world uniting.
Yes, we hope so. It's so fascinating that because I think people, obviously, for obvious reasons, the propaganda has not wanted to kind of make this connection between Zionism and anti-Semitism being together. We'll talk about. I've got another question about that a bit later. But going back to what you were saying is like you're growing up in this world. You consider yourself a humanist, but all around you, people are you're being told from the womb that you are there to breed good Israeli soldiers. As a novelist and a filmmaker, a lot of my work is about what it takes for people to challenge the perception of reality that they've grown up in. So I just wanted to ask you about that. I know you became an activist. We already mentioned you're a conscientious objector. Could you tell us about your friendship with Muhammad? What happened to him and how that reinforced your views on Zionism, if it did?
So, Muhammad al-Zaza, a dear friend, he is right now in hospital in Canada just after recovering from his 29th or 30th operation. I'll tell you what that is. So, sending you my love, Muhammad. So, I've met Muhammad 14 years ago. He was a 15-year-old boy in Gaza. Him and his cousin, his late cousin Ibrahim, they were waiting outside of their house, playing outside of the house during the month of Ramadan, where they were waiting for iftar, for the meal. And as they were playing outside, they were hit with an Israeli drone missile. Muhammad was 15, Ibrahim was 12. They were hit literally a meter away from the fence of a geriatric hospital, which
what
no
year
longer
was that,
exists.
Ronnie?
That was in 2011.
2011.
And later on, a few years later, the hospital and the entire neighborhood was razed to the ground. That was in 2014. Then again, 2021, and again, just recently, during the ongoing genocide. But they were hit with a direct hit from a missile. So instead of hearing their mothers calling them for dinner, they heard the whoosh of the missile, and the next thing was that they woke up in a hospital. Actually, Ibrahim never woke up. He suffered catastrophic injuries. They were treated for a week in Al-Shifa hospital. Then they were transferred to a hospital inside 48. 48 is what people refer to as Israel proper, what we call Palestine 48. And Ibrahim succumbed to his injuries a few days later. And Muhammad has been dealing with overcoming the many injuries to his body, and now, as we speak, he is recovering from yet another surgery, but at least he is in a safe place. He is finally in Canada, where he has started his life at the age of 27. So since he was 15 until the age of 27, he has gone through hell, just trying to get basic medical attention, and just trying to he lost his childhood, and he kind of tried to even just to get attention, to start school and so on, university. All of that became much more difficult. And what happened is that they were hit in Gaza. A week later, they were transferred into an Israeli hospital. A friend of mine heard about that, and she notified me, and myself and another friend went to visit the kids in the hospital. And ever since, kind of our lives have been bound together. Yeah, and so and that is kind of the long story of friendship and trying to deal with all the difficulties of simply trying to help one person who is more than deserving of it to reach a safe place where he can get the needed medical attention, where he can be safe, where he, without bombs, without other authorities trying to arrest him and deport him and so on.
This is a very important story that humanizes Muhammad and also your relationship with him. And it's important to discuss. And history gives us context because the Zionist settler colony of Israel was created through the violent dispossession and massacres of Palestinians. And it started in the 1920s and it's still going on. It hasn't stopped really. But very few people want to discuss these sort of atrocities, and they deny them. So could you just kind of elaborate on the sort of the dispossession and massacre of Palestinians since the formation of the Zionist colony?
Yeah, so I mentioned that exclusivity is inherent to the Zionist thinking. Okay, and when we juxtapose that with, for example, the Bund that I mentioned before, so both the Bund and the Zionists accepted that obviously there is anti-Semitism going on, while the Bund were saying, okay, I mean, there is anti-Semitism, there's racism, and we have to deal with it just like any other form of racism, The Zionists, their solution was, we need to have a place for us and only for us. Now, how do you establish a place for us and only for us when eventually it became Palestine that they were occupying, a place that was already inhabited by other people? There's only two ways of doing that. Either ethnic cleansing or genocide, either driving away the indigenous people or getting rid of them altogether. But already during the early days of the Zionist project in Palestine, there was this notion that the early Zionists, for example, people from the second Aliyah, and Professor Ilan Pape talks about it, people from the second Aliyah, the second wave of immigration of Zionists into Palestine around early 20th century, they arrived, first of all, obviously with this notion of going to a land without people, for a people without land. But when they arrived there and they saw that people were already living there, then they saw these people as the foreigners. This is the language that was used by the newcomers. They saw these people living there, where like working the land and having cultural activity and so on. And these newcomers from Eastern Europe, etc., saw the indigenous people as the foreigners. And in their diaries, they literally wrote these things. They were even sometimes hosted in the houses of Palestinians who taught them, who were kind enough to host them, even taught them how to work the land and things like that. Because the people who arrived from Europe, they didn't know anything about that. And those Palestinians who were generous enough to host them and to teach them and so on, the Zionists wrote about them, I'm staying tonight at the house of this and this foreigner. And that type of thinking about looking at Palestinians as a foreign element was there back then, and it exists to this day. And any Palestinian to this day in Palestine is regarded by the Zionists as, at the very least, a problem that has to be dealt with. So in the 20s, there was a large influx of Jews from Europe who came. There were several waves of immigration, of Aliyah. And in the 20s, I think it became kind of more established and became much more of a threat to the indigenous Palestinians. I mean, some people saw that and they didn't like it so much. And obviously, these colonialists, they didn't hide their colonialism. And then there started to be tension between those Zionists and the indigenous people of Palestine. Before that, people were living actually quite well together. People of all religions and no religion, they were living quite well together. especially in that part of the world. But in the 20s and 30s, things have changed, and there were more tensions, and then also some violent eruptions on both sides. At the same time, the Zionists were very well coordinated. I mean, they had also the backing of the powers of Britain and France and so on. All those powers that obviously that also including the Balfour Declaration that we know. Balfour was a known anti-Semite, and because, as I said, the anti-Semites and the Zionists were collaborating. I mean, that it was a win-win for them. I mean, the British people like Balfour wanted to get rid of the Jews in the UK, also have their proxy colony in the Middle East. So the Zionists were happy to basically be evicted from the UK, or be told that your place is not here, your place is in another land altogether.
Mm.
So this is kind of the type of thinking. Obviously, in the 1940s, let's say, this was already very well understood, and there is this quote by Yosef Weid, who is is regarded as the architect of the Nakba, the architect of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. He was with a so-called Jewish National Fund. Every time you see Jewish something, usually it means Zionist something, but they use the cover of Judaism to justify their crimes. So the Jewish National Fund, its mission statement is maintaining the land Jewish for perpetuity. This is their mission statement. Just think about that.
Wow.
For all Jews around the world. Okay, so they went to another land. They took over some land initially by purchasing, whether shady or not shady business, but they were purchasing the land. But obviously later on, after the ethnic cleansing, it became less purchasing and more basically the usurping, the taking over the land. But already in the 1940s, I mean, they said very clear things, and they said that no Palestinian has a place in Palestine. And here's a quote of Yosef Weitz from 1940, and this is what he has to say. There is no room for both people in this country. After the Arabs are transferred, the country will be wide open for us. The only solution is Palestine, at least Western Palestine, without Arabs. Not a single village or a single tribe must be left. There is no other solution. So in 1940, before the foundation of the state, it was very clear what the Zionists had in mind.
Yeah.
And that type of thinking obviously basically became the reason of existence and the mode of existence of the Zionist state once it was established. So if some people think that there were different types of Zionisms, some people talk about even Martin Buber and the concept of cultural Zionism, which sounds like a joke to me, but it doesn't matter right now. Maybe there were some different forms of Zionism before 1948, maybe. But just like in physics, where you have the collapse of the wave function, and when you have a superposition of states, it all collapses into one distinct version. The many forms of Zionisms, if they existed, all were directed into one distinct form in 1948 during the ethnic cleansing, and that is the only type of Zionism that we have ever since.
That's very interesting, because let's go back to the point, Ronnie, about Zionism using Judaism. So we know Judaism is a religion, but the Zionists claimed then that the only people, or the only ideology, if you like, to represent all Jews globally is Zionism and the State of Israel, and that they are the only ones who can protect Jews all over. We did a podcast not long ago with Professor Avi Shleim in his book, Memoirs of an Arab Jew, where he links the murder of Iraqi Jews in the early 50s to the Israeli Mossad. But from what I understand, the murder of Jewish people by the Zionists was started much earlier, and very few people know that the Zionists also murdered Jewish people from the 1920s. Could you challenge this narrative, first of all, about the Zionists representing all Jews, and give some examples of the atrocities against Jewish people by the Zionists. And I have another question also. Could you also discuss, Ronnie, how Judaism as a religion is not an ethnicity or nationality as claimed?
Okay, so I'll try to
Sorry,
tie these things
many
together.
questions. Sorry.
I'll try to tie these things together, and I'll tell you the story of Yaakov Israel Dehan, Jacob Israel Dehan. I don't know if you're familiar with the name. Israelis are not. The name is known among the ultra-Orthodox community, where he is regarded as a martyr. Yaakov Israel Dehan was a Dutch-born Jew who arrived in Palestine as a Zionist. When he arrived there, he got in touch with the religious folks, with the ultra-Orthodox folks in Jerusalem, and he became more religious and therefore less Zionist. He ended up being the spokesperson of the ultra-Orthodox community in Jerusalem, which was staunchly anti-Zionist. We have to know that there was roughly a 60,000 people strong community there of anti-Zionist religious Jews. They were anti-Zionist because they are Jewish, and they never wanted a Zionist state to be established in Palestine.
What year was that, Ronnie, roughly?
That was in the 1920s, 1910 and 1920s. Yeah. And Dehan was very capable. He was a lawyer. He was teaching in the university, Hebrew University. He was a journalist. He was writing for a London-based newspaper. He also wrote homoerotic poetry, by the way, at the time when it was quite difficult to do. So it was a very interesting figure, and being the spokesperson of the ultra-Orthodox community, he managed to also kind of be a bit of a diplomat and speak to the powers or the people around, and he managed to arrange a meeting, a very important meeting, between the chief rabbis of Jerusalem and the king of Hejaz, and the king in Transjordan, the emir. And they went to Transjordan, which became Jordan, to meet, and they were hosted with great honor. There was a clear agreement between the emir and the Jewish representatives. He said that he obviously very much respects Judaism and completely disagrees with Zionism, and he offered for them to have free access for Jews into his kingdom and to live there as equals without the Zionist nationalistic aspirations, or without the Zionist aspirations. For that meeting that took place in 1924, and there is a rumor, which is quite founded, that they also got a decree to that effect, basically promising free immigration for Jews. For that meeting, a few months later, Dehan was assassinated by the Zionist leadership at the time. We know this for a fact. The order to kill him came from the very top, from Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, who was the second president of Israel. It's most likely that also Ben-Gurion was in the know, but there is no proof of that. But the very leadership of the Zionist project decided to get rid of Dehan. And he was assassinated. He was shot 3 times as he left the synagogue after the evening prayer in Jerusalem. And that was a day before he was about to embark on another mission with the rabbis to speak to the British against the Balfour Declaration. And by killing Dehan, basically the Zionists managed to kill the prospect of real coexistence in Palestine. Dehan and that promise that they received and that message was basically such a big threat to the Zionists that they had to get rid of him altogether, and they did. And with that, unfortunately, they managed to basically circumvent that option. So that is a very, very important day for Zionism, but most Zionists do not even know about that. And that was in 1924. that is regarded as the first political murder in Palestine. But the Zionists were definitely putting many Jews in jeopardy throughout the years. And also before, during, and after the Holocaust, it was actually Zionist forces that not only collaborated with the Nazis with the transfer agreement, but also they have actually taken measures in order to deny help to Jews in the ghettos, to deny immigration for Jews who were fleeing Europe into anywhere other than Palestine. And these things are documented, even to the extent that, and that is really like mind-boggling, when the Nazi extermination was already in full force in 1943-44, you have two incidents, for example, where there were the two Rudolfs, Rudolf Werber and Rudolf Kastner. Rudolf Werber, along with another person, they managed to flee. They were in Auschwitz extermination camp, and they managed to flee out of there. And they wrote an account of what was happening there. And Werber went to meet with Rudolf Kastner, who was a Zionist. Rudolf Kastner received the report about what was happening, and he was the one who was silencing it, who made sure that not to publish that, because at the time he was communicating, he was negotiating with Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi Adolf Eichmann, about basically what's called the Kastner train, a train of roughly, I think, 6,000 people or so, that would basically, they were mostly people of the Zionist elite, the people who were politically aligned with them, and people of his own family, of Kastner's family, to flee and arrive in Palestine. Before Kastner was negotiating with Eichmann, before him, there was another person. And that other person, whose name will come back to me in a moment, he was less of a Zionist, and he was assigned to negotiate with Eichmann, and Eichmann offered to free 1 million Jews in exchange for what was called goods for blood, in exchange for a large shipment of all kinds of supplies. So basically to buy the lives of those mostly Hungarian Jews. And Yoel Brand, that was his name, Yoel Brand. And Brand was obviously shocked by the offer that he received by Eichmann, but he immediately notified the Zionists, and he went on a mission to Palestine to discuss this offer. And even there was that offer included as a first step, as a first installment, to release 10% of those Jews for 10% of the supplies, to show kind of a goodwill offer. He went to discuss with the Zionists. What the Zionists did is made sure that Yoel Brand will be actually silenced and arrested, and they wouldn't have him carry on this. And in his place came this Kastner that, as I told you, he was working basically to get something very different, to get far less people freed, but arriving in Palestine, and silencing what was happening in Auschwitz. But the initial offer about releasing 1 million Jews was about obviously releasing them and having them basically scatter all over the world, not necessarily arrive in Palestine. That didn't align with the Zionist thinking, because they were never concerned about just saving Jews. They were concerned about having some of those people, the ones who were capable, the ones who were politically aligned with them, arrive in Palestine for their nationalistic supremacist project.
Yeah. I think that's why we're so very careful on this podcast to be very clear, because it has been the great hasbara to conflate Zionism with Judaism, so that if you critique one, you are seen as critiquing the other. And Zionism, as you are very eloquently explaining, is a politically based thing. It is not a religion, and often actually misaligns with the best thing for Judaism and for Jews in general, as you said, 1 million Jewish lives to be spared was turned down. While we're talking about the Nazis in Germany, I mean this is stunning, but I wanted to ask you about the beginning of Nazi power in Germany. So end of January 1933. I understand at this time, even when the Nazis came into power to Germany, the Zionists and Nazis were negotiating behind closed doors, because 7 months after they came to power, on the 25th of August, 1933, the Zionists signed a controversial agreement with the Nazis known as the Havara Agreement, or the Transfer Agreement. And that agreement sits in a museum in Berlin today, so we're not making this up. And as I understand it, and I want to ask you more, the transfer agreement broke the anti-Nazi boycott, as you said, these trade requirements, and it strengthened the Nazi economy, the Nazi German economy as a result. Can you just tell us a little bit more about this particular Zionist agreement with the Nazis and the implications?
Yeah, this is exactly what happened. Basically, there was a successful Jewish boycott of Nazi Germany, mostly American Jews. And you can see fantastic pictures of great gatherings, all these posters about calling for the boycott of Nazi Germany and so on, because they were afraid for their Jewish brothers and sisters in Germany and across Europe. So there was a successful Jewish-led boycott of Nazi Germany. The Nazis were actually concerned about that. So who did they approach? They approached the Zionist Federation of Germany. And they arrived at an agreement called the Transfer Agreement, the Havara Agreement, Havara in Hebrew. And what that says in a nutshell is pretty much what you said. In exchange for basically, with the attempt of breaking the quite successful Jewish boycott of Nazi Germany, that was a financial agreement where German Jews could deposit their assets or their money in the Reichsbank, and in exchange for depositing quite a lot of money, they will be allowed to be transferred to Palestine, and they will get back the value in German commodities, in German goods. So they were not only breaking the boycott of Nazi Germany, they were funding the Nazi war machine. And they deposited, there's quite a lot of money. Another thing that happened is that they were also supporting the Templars. There were the German Templars, who became later basically the Nazi branch in Palestine. And the Templars, you had in different places the swastika flag waving in Palestine, and these were mostly by those Templars. There was in Sarona, which is in what is called Tel Aviv today, and in Jerusalem and other places. And yes, there was some Nazi activity by the Templars back then, and there was there was very clear signs of some, with, as I said, with the swastika flag waving and so on. And the Templars were also supported, and they are also part of that agreement, of that Havara agreement, with regard to basically, anyway, it's, as I said, some boring financial details. There's another thing that happened, by the way. The same Adolf Eichmann that I mentioned before, that was negotiating with Yoel Brand, and later on, after Yoel Brand was basically silenced, he was negotiating with Kastner. Eichmann arrived to Palestine for a couple of days. I think it was 1937, if I'm not mistaken. And he was very impressed with what he saw by the Zionists. He was met by a Zionist representative. And he said later, in some writings or interview, he said that after going there, he felt that if he was a Jew, he would have become an ardent Zionist. So there were these different forms of ties that existed between some Zionists and the Nazis. I don't want to say that all Zionists were collaborating with the Nazis, and there was also a lot of tension around that issue, but it definitely happened that at least some Zionists were clearly collaborating to a certain degree. And the other thing that I find as even more mind-boggling is how, when they had the chance to free a large number of Jews, and the example I gave you is not the only one. It's just like the most kind of troubling. Yeah, they didn't do, not only that they didn't do anything about it, they silenced it as much as they could.
And they blocked them. So,
And
and as you say, yeah, by circumventing the whole blockade, if you like, they enabled the war to carry on, and so many more, you know.
I would maybe, because we talked about Judaism versus Zionism, so I have to say a few things.
No.
First of all, they have totally different values. The values of Judaism and the values of Zionism have nothing to do with each other. They're quite opposites. But other than that, even before talking about the values of Judaism, I don't consider myself Jewish. I'm a human being. I don't care about the rest. But when we talk about Judaism versus Zionism, it's not only about that the values are totally different. The whole characteristic, the whole nature of Judaism has nothing to do with Zionism. They cannot even logically coincide. I mentioned before that Zionism is fundamentally about exclusivity. Judaism is a religion and nothing else. I don't accept that Judaism is anything other than a religion. And Judaism, by its very nature, it is actually inclusive. It doesn't try to convert. It makes it difficult to convert. But anyone, if you want to, not recommended, but it's possible, you may convert to Judaism. Once you go through the whole process of conversion, you will become a full-fledged member of the Jewish people, which is a religious term, like Ummah in Islam, which has nothing to do with nationalism. The other thing is that there is no concept of nationalism in Judaism. It doesn't exist. It existed long, long before the idea of nationalism. Okay?
Yeah.
So first of all, these characteristics, exclusivity versus inclusivity to a certain degree. Another thing is, while Judaism is about God and the worshiping of God, it is theocentric. Zionism is ethnocentric. It is all about ethnicity and racial characteristics. It is all about the state and the worshiping of the state.
Yeah.
Interesting.
In Judaism, if the state has any role to play whatsoever, it is in order to allow for the religious practice. That's it. In Zionism, it is the exact opposite. If the religion has any role, it is to serve the state. And this is a clear distinction that we see happening in Palestine, where Judaism in Palestine was taken over by the Zionist regime and has become subjugated to the regime. So the religious institutions in Palestine, also known as Israel, are totally subjugated to the state. And that is partly why there's only one form of Jewish practice, tradition, etc., that is being accepted, because it is that Jewish tradition or whatever that accepted to be subjugated by the state. So from the religious perspective, okay, I mean, those who are religious Jews, they should be the first ones who are concerned about how Zionism devalues and really it takes Judaism into like this base form of nationalism and being subservient of the state.
Yeah.
It's like you say, the Ummah, the Muslim, I mean, my family is Christian Palestinian, but the Muslim Ummah, you could be Chinese Muslim, Arab, African, it's not a nationality. So I think that's what you're talking about. But speaking of, just to go back to the 40s and the establishment and the Nakba. So my mother is also a Nakba survivor, like many Palestinians, and they were from 48, and her parents' villa in West Jerusalem, where they lived, was stolen, given to German Jews, the same with their building in Haifa, where she was born. And the systematic ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians happened already before the British left, in the 1947 onwards, and not before. And it then culminated in the Nakba in 48, with over 700,000 Palestinians being ethnically cleansed, and the same thing during the Nakba in 67, where over 300,000 Palestinians were also expelled. And no restitution, never allowed back to their homes, despite internationally recognized laws of right of return. And now we have over 7 million Palestinians who remain in exile and displaced. But this ongoing Nakba of the indigenous Palestinians hasn't stopped really from their historical homeland. It's ongoing. And it's an injustice that we know, but there's a denial of the Nakba. So there's a big emphasis on the Holocaust and the story of European Jews moving to Palestine, a land, quote, without the people for people without the land. But at the same time, this ongoing injustice and the denial of the Nakba is without addressing that, nothing will change. So can you just talk a bit about that?
Whenever I talk to people who are pro-Palestinian or people who would discuss the issue of Palestine, the first thing that I would ask is, okay, what about the right of return? That is the yardstick. If someone doesn't support the right of return of Palestinian refugees, they don't support Palestinians. They don't support Palestinian rights at all.
Why do you say that?
For someone to say that I'm against the occupation, I will respond by saying, which occupation? That of 48 or that of 67? Okay. If you're against the occupation of 67, what I call the minor occupation, then you're not against occupation at all. I mean, if you only want to end that minor occupation and not the actual occupation and apartheid and ethnic cleansing and pillage and all the rest and colonialism, because those who want to end the occupation of 67 are doing so in order to maintain, to legitimize their cherished race state within its smaller territory. So Palestine was occupied in 48. By the way, even technically speaking, the military occupation started in 1948. There was military rule. That military rule, which was inside 48, inside Palestine 48, also known as Israel proper, that ended in 1966. A year later, the military occupation transitioned to the West Bank and Gaza. So even those quote-unquote liberal Zionists who say I'm against occupation, they are very selective with their understanding of what occupation is, or just looking at history, because if they only start counting the occupation in 67, then what happened until 66? Okay, and actually the exact same practice was transformed and moved to the West Bank and Gaza, but it was kind of, it was being perfected and then moved to the West Bank and Gaza. The settlements, people say, oh, I'm against the settlement. Which settlements? That of 48 or that of 67? When the Gaza ghetto uprising took place on the 7th of October, the Palestinians from Gaza were arriving in these kibbutzim, and they said, we're the mustautanat, we're the settlements. These are the settlements. 70% of all Gazans are refugees, many of them from just across the fence. There's no border between Gaza and the rest of Palestine. Just like there was no border between the Warsaw Ghetto and the rest of Warsaw, there's a fence, a highly militarized fence, with every tool of remote controlled murder machines possible. But when they broke through and they arrived at the other part, they arrived at their land. When they throw these kites with what is it called, incendiary kites or something, and they manage to burn some field across the fence of Gaza, they're burning their own land. It's kind of people don't think about it that way. But the vast majority, as I said, 70% of all Palestinians in Gaza are refugees. How so? Because there were ethnic cleansed in 1948 from the southern part, from the Nakba region, all the way to Jaffa. Jaffa, 95% of the people of Jaffa became refugees in 1948. Jaffa, which was one of the most thriving, successful cosmopolitical cities in the region, became totally destroyed in 1948, and the vast majority of its people fled because they had no choice.
And
literally thrown into the water. I mean, literally were basically found yeah, you see those boats fleeing from Jaffa. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, sorry, just to say Jaffa or Jaffa, as the Western audience would know it, was supposed to, when the UN illegally partitioned Palestine, it was supposed to remain in Palestinian territory. But despite that, yeah, they ethnically cleansed it, basically. Sorry to interrupt, Ronnie.
Yes, yes, and so the vast majority of the people in Jaffa became refugees. The people from Jaffa to the south, to the Nakba region, they were ethnically cleansed. And most of them were driven by the Zionists towards Gaza. And this is how Gaza was carved out of the map. This is why the shape is like that. Obviously, there was some people living there throughout the centuries, but the most part of the people in Jaffa are those refugees who were housed in this place that was designated to be a refugee camp, treated as a concentration camp, and nowadays this concentration camp has been transformed into an extermination camp.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
But the story of Jaffa is not the story of the 7th of October, and it's not the story of the siege, and it's not the story of the occupation of 67. It is the story of 48. It is the story of Palestine.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of the story of Palestine and borders, why is it that the settler colony of Israel intentionally doesn't have a constitution and doesn't define its borders? Could you discuss that a little bit?
So people think that there is something legitimate and normal about the Zionist race state. There isn't. It has this much legitimacy. It has this much democracy. Okay? There's absolutely nothing about the Zionist state that anyone should support. It was founded, by the way, there was nothing legal even about the foundation of the state by the UN and so on. There was an excellent legal analysis that was submitted to the ICJ not in the discussion about apartheid, but in the discussion about what's called the occupation. And the so-called Palestinian so-called authority approached the ICJ in the past about the occupation of 67. But along with the discussion in the ICJ, along with the so-called Palestinian so-called authority, there were also other states that joined, including a representative of the Arab League who gave an excellent analysis of the foundation of the Zionist state and how every aspect of it was done illegally. So I would recommend everyone to watch that. So this is just from the, I'm not a legal scholar. I don't want to say things that I don't totally understand about, but I mean, from the legal aspect, there was no legal basis to establish that state. Questioning.
Absolutely, Ronnie. And just to add to the audience who don't know the history, there are only 33 nations who voted at the UN, and they're all the colonialists, British, Western, white. So they decided just the fate of a country that didn't belong to them in the first place. Yeah,
exactly.
And it wasn't agreed by the Palestinians or the Arabs either.
Yes. Now, another thing to remember about the foundation of that state, there was the Balfour Declaration, which basically, by that anti-Semite Lord Balfour, but even in that Balfour Declaration by the British, which was a horrible declaration, still it said that they will establish what they call a Jewish state, what I call a Zionist state, in Palestine, but that it will serve all those people of that land. Okay, they will partition the land and they will establish a Jewish state in Palestine, but it doesn't discriminate between the types of population there. Okay, it says it explicitly. The partition plan, same idea. The partition plan of 1947, just before the foundation of the Zionist state, decided to give away more than half of the land to less than half of the population. You had about 1/3 of the population in Palestine were of Jewish descent. Most of them were newcomers, settler colonialists, who came over to take other people's land. As we mentioned before, there were all these waves of immigration during the early 20th century. And these people who were about 1/3 of the population and had no more than 10% of the land in their possession that they actually purchased, were given more than half of the land, like 56% of the land.
Yeah.
That was already obviously unacceptable to Palestinians. The other problem was for the Zionists, because in that part that was designated for them to be the quote-unquote Jewish state, they were supposed to share the land with about the same number of Palestinians. So the 600,000 ethnic Jews, whatever that means, I'm using the term ethnic Jews, very like people of Jewish descent, okay, let's put it this way. They were supposed to share the land with another 500,000, almost the same number of Palestinians in that place that was supposed to be the quote-unquote Jewish state. So even though they accepted the partition plan on paper, they never, ever wanted to implement it. They couldn't accept it in practice. It was an impossibility for the Zionists to actually accept the partition plan, because the whole idea of the Zionist project is exclusivity. It just doesn't go together. When you see these like 600,000 plus 500,000, it doesn't make any sense to them. It didn't make sense then, and it doesn't make sense today.
Yeah.
So how do you go about it?
Mm.
What happened in practice is, because genocide was not that popular in 1948, so they went for the second best option as far as they were concerned, which was ethnic cleansing. Already back then, they were a regional, or they were a military power, at least in terms of them versus the Palestinians. They also had agreements with Jordan. Golda Meir even went to visit the King of Jordan a couple of times, and they had agreed how to separate, how to partition, to divide the land between them. And there were other agreements, and basically the Zionists in 1948, they carried out their very well-planned act of ethnic cleansing, which is actually drafted in Plan Dalet, Plan D of the Haganah, from March of 1948. They started the ethnic cleansing actually a few months even earlier. By the time that they established their state in May of 48, already 1/3 of all Palestinians were already in the process of being ethnically cleansed. 1/3 of those that eventually ended up being ethnically.
Yeah,
So this is the thinking.
That's before the British left and before they established it.
Yes.
So already very few people know that.
Yes, under the eyes of the British, there were ethnic cleansing operations that were taking place by those militias, Zionist militias, who were much more organized and well-funded and supplied than the few Palestinian armed forces, which were just not well organized at all, because this is not what they did.
No.
And they knew, the Zionists knew that when they drafted this plan, Dalet, they knew that they had, it was after 1 year of deliberation about it, and they knew that they had enough military power to carry out this process of ethnic cleansing, and this is exactly what they did.
Yeah.
And ever since, this is the other issue that is even more crucial, ever since, to this day, these Palestinians who have been ethnically cleansed are denied the right to come back home.
Yeah. And let's not forget, in 1936-39, during the Palestinian revolt for their independence, the Zionists and the British jointly worked on crushing the Palestinian revolt and expelling and ethnically cleansing and killing people for 3 years, where the Palestinian resistance became non-existent. By the time Plan Dalet, or Plan D, as you say, came into effect, there was no really effective resistance left, or very little.
Right.
So
and
go ahead.
No, so there was a real organized act of ethnic cleansing under the eyes of the British. I've had, when I gave a talk in Dortmund some years ago, there was this elder British guy who came to me and he asked me, did you see The Promise? You know, The Promise, the series on Channel 4? I haven't watched it, but I've heard about it. He told me, I'm the grandfather. He didn't mean he's actually the grandfather, but he meant the story of the grandfather is his own story. He was there as a British soldier, and he saw the ethnic cleansing happening right in front of his eyes. And seeing that, he could not unsee it. And ever since he was a pro-Palestine activist. It affected him so much as a British soldier at the time. So this was done literally under their eyes. and under their control.
Yeah. Well, we discussed this, which I didn't know, is that the colony of Israel doesn't have a constitution, a formal constitution, or defined borders. The big thing we've had for years and years and years, I grew up thinking that Israel was the only democracy in the Middle East. That was what I was fed. Is it the only democracy? Is it a democracy at all?
Yes.
Considering, I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but I am thinking about the 2 million Palestinians from 1948 who are not known as Palestinians, but as Arabs, and the kind of a way to sort of erase identity. And we're talking about people like Hanan's mom in this section. What is it a democracy?
So I owe you a response about constitution and so on. So Israel has no constitution. It can never have a constitution. It has no predefined boundaries, borders. It has no predefined immigration policy. There is no clear stated immigration policy. It is all in the hands of the Ministry of Immigration, because they always have to make sure that the right type of people come in and not the wrong type of people. It doesn't recognize its own nationality. Legally speaking, my legal status under Israeli apartheid is as a privileged Israeli Jew. Not because I consider myself Israeli or Jewish, but because my citizenship is defined by the state as Israeli, but my nationality is defined as Jewish. My fellow citizens in Israel, who are also Israeli citizens, but are not among the privileged group, they have other nationalities, like Arab or Circassian or Druze. The Zionist state, the state of Israel, recognizes more than 130 different nationalities, other than one. It's not Palestinian, it's Israeli nationality. They don't recognize, and they can never recognize.
Why?
When some Israeli Jews took this to the Supreme Court, they said, because they were not religious and they didn't like it that it says nationality Jewish in their ID, they said, why can't we just have Israeli nationality? What's the problem? This went all the way up to the Supreme Court. You had a whole bunch of judges discussing it for a long time, and eventually they came up and said, we cannot acknowledge having an Israeli nationality because acknowledging that would undermine the very character of the state of Israel. And that is a very true statement. Acknowledging an Israeli nationality would mean that there would be some basis of equal standing for its citizens. And if that's not bad enough for the Zionists, it would also mean that it nullifies pretty much every single law that was legislated since the very foundation, because the very first laws were all about establishing apartheid. The very first law is the law of return. The law of return, aims to counter the right of return. It denies the right of return. But it also, in the law, it has the term Jewish in it. And it's not about religion, one's religion. It's about one's ethnicity, racial, whatever you want to call it, by the state. And it is all about creating a whole legal structure, a whole legal system that is about differentiating between the Übermenschen and the Untermenschen, the superhumans and the subhumans. Mm. And there are several laws that have, 3 laws that have explicitly the term Jewish in them, and many more laws, more than 50 laws that depend on these former laws. So implicitly, they are discriminatory laws. And these things touch on every aspect of daily life for those roughly 2 million people who are inside Palestine in 48, who are regarded as Israeli citizens, but they are far from being equal citizens. But not only that, these laws also are responsible for the fact that to this day, the 7 or 8 million people in the diaspora, the refugees who are in exile, cannot go back to their homes. Yeah. So actually, when we talk about the numbers, I mentioned the partition plan that could never be accepted by the Zionists because they were 1/3 of the population, and obviously they were not even the majority to begin with, and they didn't want to share the land, etc. But they are still 1/3 of the population. Whatever we think about them, they are still only 1/3 of the population. So how is it that they think that they are the majority? How is it that they think that whatever? Because half of all Palestinians, more than half of all Palestinians, are kept in forced exile for the past 7 decades. This is the most crucial issue that we have to take into account when we talk about the activity against Palestinians. And then among those who are on the land in Palestine, they are being segregated, separated, held in different ghettos, concentration camps, and so on.
Let's talk about that. So it's really interesting. So the fact of having, if you had an Israeli citizenship concept, then you would be forced to give the same citizenship to the Palestinians from 1948, who are citizens of Israel. So it's more of a Jewish nationality concept, which isn't a nationality any more than
It's not a nationality.
Caucasian or any of that. It's more like an ethnic background. Okay, so let's talk about apartheid. You touched on it there. You know, my parents and grandparents dealt with apartheid in South Africa as Indians there. Most people actually don't, they think of it's so associated with South Africa that they can't imagine that what we know as Israel is an apartheid regime, even though many institutions have, formalized it as such. What does that everyday life, that frankly humiliation of Palestinians who live under apartheid in Israel look like, or the Palestinians who are under illegal occupation, although we can argue that, as you say, the occupation began in 1948. So let's just talk about apartheid as a general concept within that state.
So Israeli apartheid was founded at the same time of South African apartheid.
Yeah.
Both in 1948.
48, yeah.
The case of apartheid South Africa is quite literally more a case of black and white. It is much more about skin color than anything else. And they didn't try to hide it as well as the Zionists did. Okay, so when people talk about apartheid in South Africa, it is very clear. It is in your face. And, and it's important to understand that there are two aspects of apartheid. There's what's called petty apartheid and grand apartheid. Petty apartheid are the segregated restaurants and buses and benches and so on. And grand apartheid is the overarching apartheid. That is the whole legal system. That is all about more than preferential treatment. It's about the racial domination and subjugation of one group by the others. The Zionist form of apartheid is much more sophisticated because it gives you this veneer of normality, veneer of democracy. And if you only scratch the surface, you will see what it's really all about. So they have managed to basically create a situation where it seems like a democracy, even though there's not an iota of democracy there, and I'll be happy to explain that. But actually, apartheid is what's called grand apartheid is everything that state is about. They don't have the petty apartheid aspect. They don't have the segregated restaurants aspect or segregated schools. Theoretically, one could go to the same school, like, let's call it Jews and Arabs, even though it's Palestinians and Zionists, but, because they use this weird terminology that I reject. Theoretically, Jews and Arabs could go to the same school. In practice, it doesn't happen. Because there is segregation, only that it is kind of self-imposed. People don't want to interact with each other. And even if the liberal city of Tel Aviv, it's enough if you have a Palestinian neighbor in your building that, you will hear some serious disagreements there. And some of the other neighbors will try to actually kick that Palestinian neighbor out. By law, they can live there. In practice, less so. So in practice, people tend to segregate or to live in a more secluded way with their own people. Now, another way that Israeli apartheid works is that you have two types of laws. Or two types of rights. You have civil rights and you have national rights. Civil rights are, for example, the right for access to water and education and healthcare. National rights are preserved for one and only one group of people, which I belong to. Now, whenever these two are in contradiction, obviously, you know what the court will do. The court will obviously always prefer those national rights over the civil rights of people. And the greatest tool of Israeli apartheid is actually its Supreme Court, which for some reason, some people think that it is very progressive. First of all, there's no democracy, so it cannot be progressive. Secondly, when you have only 1/3 of the population that have rights. Secondly, it is actually the main vehicle of apartheid. It is the one that is legitimizing and making sure, giving cover to apartheid.
Mm.
So I'll give you an example. In the Nakba region that was ethnically cleansed in 1948, you also have Bedouins. And the Bedouin population, which are more kind of nomadic, at some point they settled in some places, many times under the agreement or order of the state to settle in a certain territory. Later on, the Zionist state legislated some laws, and all of a sudden, overnight, all of these places of settlement became unrecognized by the state because they simply listed the places of residence across the country, and they just missed out on 50 of them or so. About 40 in the south and a few in the north. And overnight, they became unrecognized, and overnight, they became squatters. Now, and they are to this day, they are not connected in many of these places. They're not connected to infrastructure. They don't have access to running water, sewage, etc., electricity. But they are still citizens of the state, citizens of 48. They pay taxes. Now, if they will challenge that in the Supreme Court, and they will say, we need access to healthcare, we need access to running water, etc., what will happen? And it did happen. The Supreme Court will debate the issue, and then they will say, yes, you are deserving of healthcare, but you are living in an unrecognized place, you are squatters, so you will get your clinic 3 kilometers away. You can walk there and get your health services. You will have access to water, but you will have your water tanks a few kilometers away. If one quote unquote Jewish couple will buy a piece of land and settle there, become their neighbors, immediately they will be connected to the infrastructure. So that's how one aspect of apartheid, how it exists inside 48. Another thing is that people don't know is that by law, you have two different legal paths from the very first day of one's life. When a baby is born, they get Israeli citizenship based on two different laws. A baby who is born to the privileged group, to privileged Israeli Jews, will get their citizenship based on the law of return. Even though they haven't returned anywhere, they were born there, they will get their citizenship based on the law of return. Okay? Which is the very first law that was legislated. An Israeli citizen, a baby who is born to Israeli citizens who are not among the privileged group, they get their citizenship based on another law, which is the law of residence. Okay?
I didn't know that. Interesting.
And that is how apartheid exists, because it is all about creating two different classes. So you mentioned that your parents are originally from India. You know, in India, you have a very clear case, or at least had a very clear case of a caste system, right? This is a legalized caste system in Israel. This is how it is built.
Yeah.
There's no way around it.
Yeah.
Now, in the excellent apartheid report by Tilly and Falk, which was the first report that actually talked about apartheid, which was a UN report. Afterwards, there was also the apartheid reports by Amnesty and Al-Haq of 2022. All the other apartheid reports, you can throw them to the garbage. And I can explain why. But the UN report on apartheid is important in several aspects. One is that it regards all Palestinians as being victims of Israeli apartheid. All 14 million Palestinians, half of which are in forced exile, are right now suffering from the practice of Israeli apartheid, which is a crime against humanity, which is on par with genocide. Secondly, when they talk about those Palestinians who are citizens of the state, they give this analysis and they say, you know that one of the laws, I said there is no constitution. We have to talk about that in a second. One of the laws, it's a long answer. I'm sorry.
Oh,
there's many aspects of apartheid.
No, I think you're touching on a lot of things that we sort of glossed over in previous things. So it's really interesting to hear it from your perspective.
So one of the laws, which is a basic law, Israel does not have a constitution. It can never have a constitution, and I'll touch on that in a second. It has what they call constitutional laws, which are not obviously a constitution, which are basic laws. A basic law is a law that is very difficult to change. You need to have a supermajority to change that. one of these laws, Basic Law, Article 7A of Basic Law, the Knesset, says that a party cannot run for elections and a representative cannot run for elections if they negate Israel as a quote-unquote Jewish and democratic state. What does Jewish and democratic mean? The only way to understand the term Jewish and democratic is as a euphemism for Zionist and apartheid. Whenever you see the term Jewish, you have to replace it to Zionist. Whenever you see democratic, you have to replace it to apartheid. Then it all makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay?
That's a very interesting way to look at it, definitely.
So the law says that if you negate Israel as a quote-unquote Jewish and democratic state, and I can prove that what I said about Zionist and apartheid, this is what is meant, because this has been discussed in the court, and the court's decision is exactly to that effect. So I can prove that. But in any case, anyone who negates Israel as a quote-unquote Jewish and democratic state cannot even run for elections. So that means that if you want to participate in the parliament, run for elections, or even vote for that parliament for that matter, which I vehemently refuse to do, then you basically have to accept to be subjugated under apartheid, and then you can discuss about getting more fundings for this or that locality, and I don't know, things like that. And in the UN report on apartheid, they look at that law and they say that this is akin to allowing slaves to vote, but not in order to abolish slavery. So the slaves, we can better the situation of the slaves. We can give them better treatment. They can even participate in our parliament if they want. Anyway, their vote doesn't mean anything. There is one thing that they can never do, which is to democratize the place, to actually abolish apartheid and demand full equality. And when we talk about equality, I say that if I only say that I support the resistance or something like that, then I will regard it as a traitor. But if I say that I support equality in Israel, it is outside of their scope of thinking. It is incapable for any Zionist whatsoever to conceive the notion of full equality, because it goes against everything that Zionism is about, everything that they think about themselves. And finally, I'll say about the Constitution, there is no Constitution, there can never be a Constitution, because the Constitution, the whole point of it is to safeguard the same rights, at least for the citizens, at least. And having that would, in an instant, abolish the Zionist race state. It can no longer be a race state if there is a constitution. It doesn't matter what the constitution says. A constitution, by definition, cannot make that caste system, cannot make that distinction. The other thing is that when I have to explain why Zionism is so bad, I say, well, I think that if you can never have a constitution to something, that tells you that something is so bad. It doesn't matter what your system is, I don't care. If you cannot write that in a constitution, it means that there's nothing legitimate about it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Interesting. So that's interesting, because we covered the constitution, defining the borders, democracy, and it's good to hear it from someone like you, Ronnie, who grew up there, born there, who know the system better than most people who are in the West who don't hear these things. So it's important to share that. So thank you for that. Before we move, anything else you want to say, or shall I move to Gaza? Because I have a few questions on Gaza.
Go on.
Yeah. Okay. So that's really enlightening, actually. Thank you. So let's discuss Gaza, because most people, or Gaza, as we say, most people now in the West have discovered, they think the war and everything started on October 23, and they're witnessing this horrendous, brutal genocide that's been going on for 17 months, and the imposed starvation, which is also a war crime. There's been a siege for over 17 years on Gaza, and there's been a continuous recurring campaign, bombings over the years. And this has been persistent. It's never stopped, these tactics. But most people in the West or the global North don't know that this is an ongoing thing. So can you just kind of give a little bit of history of that? I know you said over 70% of Palestinians, probably more like 80%, have been ethnically cleansed from 67 and 48. Just can you talk about the daily life and the siege, and also the March of Return, that started as a peaceful March of Return in 2018. So just kind of a bit of background on Gaza.
So Gaza, other than having a small community there throughout the ages, most of Gaza is, as I mentioned, basically is the concentration of those refugees that were ethnically cleansed in 1948. And whenever we talk about Gaza, it all goes back to that, to still living as refugees to this day, 7 decades later. Now, unlike the West Bank, which is basically a little bigger and could be divided into different Bantustans, Gaza is treated as one territory, and it is controlled by the Zionist state in every possible way. So the air, the sea, the land are all controlled with the most advanced technology, which I guess that we'll talk about, Elbit and all the others. They have their autonomous tools, which are all about controlling those people inside that concentration camp. But it goes even farther than that. The Zionists have even drafted formulas. The Ministry of Defense of Israel drafted formulas to count the caloric intake for the people of Gaza. And we're talking about almost 20 years ago, okay, over a decade ago. And this was actually even shown in the Israeli courts, because at some point this was challenged in court and they had to submit these documents. And it is proven. They have drafted formulas to count the caloric intake for the people in Gaza. And they even made amendments to the formula. And they said, well, the people in Gaza, they don't need so much fresh fruit and vegetables. They need more white flour and sugar and oil. This is all written there. So that type of thinking from well over a decade ago is not only monstrous. This is a Nazi type of thinking. They say that they never implemented the formulas. I don't care if they did or they didn't. The very fact that they went to that length tells you everything you need to know about those who are ruling over Gaza. And no, it's not Hamas that is ruling over Gaza. Hamas is the biggest gang in prison, for that matter, okay? Or it's the biggest whatever inside that concentration camp. But the ones who are controlling every single aspect, to the extent of how many calories are allowed inside. And on one day you're allowed to have a dry coriander, but not fresh coriander. On one day you're not allowed to have pasta or chocolate or whatever. It's like they have limited to that extent what goes in and out of Gaza. So they are the ones, the Zionists are the ones who are controlling. By the way, they are also controlling the registry of every newborn, etc. It is all controlled by Israel. Another thing that we have to know about Gaza, which also is like well over a decade since this is relevant, is that the vast majority of the water in Gaza is not potable. It's not suitable for human consumption. 95% of the water is toxic, and it is only getting worse. So the UN already years ago said that Gaza will become uninhabitable by the year 2020. Every time they kind of extended a bit, but by the year 2020, they said it will become uninhabitable. Now it is becoming uninhabitable, obviously, for obvious reasons. But I'm just trying to say that this level of control of this amount of population, over 2 million people, is done in the most barbaric way, monstrous way possible. And all aspects of life of Gaza are being controlled by the people outside of that concentration camp. When in 2018, when Gazans, after being bombarded every few years, or what Israel calls mowing the lawn, because according to the Israeli regime, they have to maintain that control over Gaza. And in their terms, it is just like mowing the lawn. Every few years, we have to get rid of the whatever, the weed that is growing there. So after all these bombardments of 2008, 9, 2014, obviously there were many others. In 2018, Gazans went on the Great March of Return. It was done on the eve of Passover, which was the same time, the same date of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, by the way. Yeah, and they decided to go on these basically peaceful demonstrations along the wall, not the wall, along the fence or the militarized wall or whatever, to demand the right to return home. Unfortunately, many supposedly pro-Palestinian organizations, they were describing these demonstrations as demonstrations against the siege. Organizations like If Not Now and so on, for liberal Zionist organizations. They were describing it as a demonstration against the siege. It was not. It was a demonstration also against the siege, but as the name suggests, it was about their right to return home just across the fence. Okay, so, and for doing that, and for demonstrating peacefully, just demanding their basic rights, they were shot at by snipers. Many people were murdered, many people were injured. So given all of that and many, many other atrocities that happened there over the decades, what happened, a year and a half ago in Gaza is basically, unfortunately, not surprising. I mean, unfortunately, it is, as I said, the Gaza ghetto uprising. When you live in a ghetto, being surrounded by those who are by now proper Nazis, and where every aspect of your life is being dictated to the extent of deciding about your right to life altogether, yes, then at some point they break out of there, or they at least try.
Yeah. But Ronnie, what's really also shocking is that from a recent poll that shows 92% of Israelis feel that not enough force and firepower has been used on Palestinians in Gaza, and that the majority of Israelis continue to support the genocide, and at the same time pushing for the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from Gaza, East Jerusalem, the occupied West Bank, the legally occupied West Bank, basically. And we see soldiers openly bragging about the atrocities they're committing, posting online. We see the leaders sharing their genocidal plans openly, their ethnic cleansing plans. But this level of profound dehumanization of Palestinians, it's really hard to come to terms with. And it's not, you can't just say it's the government or it's the military, or it seems like it's pervasive throughout Israeli society, if you like. So can you talk about how did it even reach that point that the majority of Israelis are openly supporting a genocide, the crime of all crimes, and knowing how Jewish people have suffered during the Holocaust and throughout the centuries in Europe and so on?
So during the attacks in 2008, 2009, what's called Cast-led, during the assault in 2014, known as Protective Edge, when 551 children have been murdered, 89 families obliterated completely. In today's terms, it pales in comparison, but I mean, these are like unbelievable, unimaginable numbers over the course of a 51-day assault where, they murdered, for example, 550 children. At that time, in the previous assaults on Gaza, you had the same numbers coming from Israeli society. 95% of Israelis thought that it was absolutely justified. Actually, only 3 or 4% thought that Israel was using excessive force in Gaza.
Even then.
So the numbers today are actually, unfortunately, unsurprising.
Uncomfortable.
It's incomprehensible, it's unbelievable, but it is also, knowing Israeli society is unsurprising, and that's why I refer to them as proper Nazis. Because this is what it has clearly become. I used to say that I am an anti-fascist from a completely fascist state. Now I can clearly say that I'm an anti-Nazi from a completely Nazi state. I haven't visited since the 7th of October. Last time I was in Palestine was just before, a couple of months before. And I went there, and I also went to these silly demonstrations of the so-called liberal Zionists against Netanyahu. And I didn't go there in order to join them in the demonstrations. I went to actually do street interviews to actually expose what they were all about, that they were actually even a greater problem than Netanyahu himself. I should publish these interviews at some point.
Yes, you
Anyway,
should.
but ever since 7th October, I haven't been to Palestine. But I heard from other friends there and friends who are going there that it has become a whole other the atmosphere has become so toxic, so really I don't know if I have the right words, which takes me, back to the, again, Nazi analogy and the question of 90 years ago, what would I have done in Germany as a German dissident?
Mm.
At what point would I pack up and leave?
Mm.
What would I do against the regime, and what can I do? All of these questions, I think, are questions that every Israeli that hasn't completely lost their humanity should be asking themselves. So I unfortunately, the fact that 95% of the water is toxic in Gaza, the fact that Israel is calculating the caloric intake, it doesn't bother any of those Israelis. It is monstrous on the side of the decision makers, but it is just as bad on the side of Israeli society. And unlike some other countries where the government doesn't represent its people, in Israel, I think that the government is very representative of its people.
I think that's what's really shocking and hard to get our heads around, that, mothers, wives, children, it seems consistent and it's not in contradiction. And when you see the demonstrations now, it's more about the hostages or getting rid of Netanyahu, but nothing about Palestinian rights and equality. That just doesn't even factor in, which is really the ultimate level of dehumanization.
Look, when people talk about the hostages, now it's about, I hear it's 59. I'm not sure. I don't keep count, because as far as I'm concerned, there are 2.3 million hostages in Gaza, along with 10,000 or so languishing in Israeli dungeons, in Israeli prisons. But when I talk to people from my family, for example, whatever, and they speak about the hostages, or anyone in the media who speaks about the hostages, and they only count the 50 or 200 or whatever it is, that is the most racist and monstrous discourse that I can imagine. The fact that people can only see 200 or so people of certain racial ethnic background and totally disregard, treat as less than subhuman another 2.3 million people, that is the most beyond racist discourse that I can imagine. By the way, when I was demonstrating in London and so on, then when the genocide started, I made this big banner immediately after, the first week after it started, saying Jews against genocide. And just to make it clear, if it wasn't clear enough, underneath I wrote anti-Nazi, anti-fascist, anti-Zionist. And I don't identify as Jewish. As I said, I don't care about these things. But for that purpose, because it was very clear from the 8th of October, it was very clear where this was going. I thought that Jews against genocide is the right message, exactly because of the history and the Nazi analogy and everything.
Yeah.
Later on, I made another banner saying, "Bring them home now." I used the same font as the Zionist slogan, only in Palestine colors. And I put a handala in the middle. And I wrote, "Bring them home now," in Palestine colors. And it said 2.3 million hostages in Gaza and 7.5 million in exile. So this is kind of the message that I have to offer in return.
Yeah. So how is your family and friends who are still there and abroad and so on? How do they feel about all this and your views? Sorry, just a quick diversion question.
Well, it's been more difficult since the 7th of October. I mean, we are very close, and we have good ties, and I used to visit quite a lot. Since 7 October, it became much more difficult. for the reasons that I mentioned earlier.
I can imagine.
Well, I'm very, very, very sorry to hear it. And but I think you've answered. I had a question about dehumanization, but I think you're answering it very well. It's just that it's a pervasive element of society there that's causing the problem. So let me ask you my previous question, the next one, which is about ceasefires. We are right now seeing that again, Israel has broken unilaterally the ceasefire in Gaza. Of course, they say that it's not their fault, but I think that has been debunked quite easily. It feels like they never have any intention of ever moving to the second stage or the third stage of a ceasefire agreement. And that's been like an ongoing policy for decades now. And it's happening in Lebanon, it's happening in Palestine right now in front of our eyes. And yet we see almost no outrage from Palestinians or from mainstream legacy media. What we see is blaming the victims for that. Can you just tell us a little bit about what your knowledge of these breakings of ceasefires and why that has always been policy for the Zionists?
Shamim, you mean not from Israelis, not from Palestinians, I think.
Yes, sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah, I think it all goes back to the fact that the only way for the Zionists to deal with the situation is by brute force. I mean, I said, if you want to have an exclusive state, there's only two ways to do it: ethnic cleansing or genocide. And genocide was always in the cards. From the beginning, they started with the concerted effort of ethnic cleansing. They carried on with the ethnic cleansing. It is an ongoing act of ethnic cleansing. It never ceased for a single day. It never ceased in practice. It never ceased in the laws, and definitely not in the thinking. Every Palestinian, even those who are born in Palestine, even those who are Israeli citizens, yes? But any Palestinian who was born in Palestine is regarded as, at the very least, as a problem that has to be dealt with. The question of how do we deal with the problem changes between different types of Zionists. Actually, there are only two types of Zionists that I know, and I can explain. But it changes between the two types of Zionists, and there's some tension between these two. The ones who are for Bibi and against Bibi, Netanyahu, and so on. But about Gaza, literally, Zionists are incapable of seeing Palestinians as human beings, or they're incapable of seeing Palestinians, period. Even people who are not necessarily don't consider themselves racist or don't come across as racist, who on a one-on-one basis, they would not be racist to anyone, that they interact with. When they think of the Palestinians as a whole, they are literally incapable of seeing them. And they're incapable of seeing what they are causing to Palestinians because they are so self-obsessed. It is all about, it is the way that I explain Zionism, going back to Zionism for a second, the way that I explain Zionism is, the easiest way to explain it is looking at it as a cult. And it is all about us versus them. And if you are from them, you are against us. If you're on the other side, you are necessarily against us. This is why they have a problem with people like myself, that they don't know what to do with me, and whenever they do look at me, they see me as the greatest traitor because I am among those who are acting against the cult. But this is this type of thinking doesn't allow them to see Palestinians.
Yeah.
Another way to look at it, there are different ways to look at Zionism, but I think that I mentioned before that there is a psychological element here, and it's not about the facts. It doesn't matter how many facts I will give them about the atrocities that are being carried out on a daily basis, hourly basis in Gaza and throughout Palestine. It doesn't register, because we can look at it again from a psychological aspect. If it did register, it would mean that everything that they believe about themselves is a lie. It would mean that they have no moral basis. They are not the good people in the story. They are not the ones. They want to come across as something else. At least no one wants to think that they are the bad guys, basically.
They want to believe their own Kool-Aid, basically, and their own hasvara and propaganda. And Ronnie, you've also been active. I just wanted to talk about, you've been active with Palestine Action. So could you talk a bit about how you're treated by the authorities? And also you mentioned earlier, Elbit systems. Could you maybe also talk about what they manufacture, the damage they're doing? Because I think they're all interlinked.
So a couple of years ago, I went with a group of actionists from Palestine Action to smash up the Elbit Systems headquarters in Bristol, UK. Elbit Systems is Israel's #1 arms manufacturer. They produce everything from drones and quadcopters, the little ones that fly and lure people with the sounds of crying children and then shoot them down. They have different versions. They have ones with with machine guns, ones with little bomblets, all sorts, very sophisticated. The drones are the UAVs.
Yes, sorry, Ronnie, just to mention to the audience who don't know, these are being used in Gaza because when people hear children crying or they come out to try to help, and then, so
yes,
the backstory.
And they have the UAVs, the unmanned aerial vehicles that are flying 24/7 over Gaza. The head of the Israeli Air Force has said in the past that they have tiled the airspace of Gaza. There's not an inch that is not being monitored 24/7, and you have many of them flying over Gaza, and not only monitoring but also dropping bombs, as they did on Muhammad and Ibrahim that I mentioned before. Most of the flight hours by the Israeli Air Force are actually done by these UAVs, over 80% of the flight hours. And Elbit Systems is a world leader in these UAVs. They supply 85% of the drones for Israel and also to many, many other countries, including the most despotic regimes, including regimes that are committing genocide like Myanmar. They have supplied Myanmar before, during, and after the genocide, even against the ruling of the Israeli court that said that you cannot sell them your weapons. They still carried on violating the court's order and carried on doing that. And many other despotic regimes around the world. So they produce these things. They also produce weapons that are illegal to be used against the civilian population, like white phosphorus and cluster munition. They produce all kinds of different aspects of that genocidal industry. So every aspect of every aspect of military action in Gaza and by Israel has an Elbit component, an Elbit logo on it. Not only that, they work in tandem with the Israeli army. They produce per IGF requests, and then they perfect their murder machines on the bodies of Palestinians. They are using Gaza as their laboratory, and right now it is the time of their lives. Right now it is their research and development in action, and not only they are perfecting their murder machines, they have boots on the ground where they're working alongside the Israeli soldiers in perfecting these things. Later on, they will sell it to the rest of the world as being battle tested. That's how they call it.
Yeah.
Literally tested on the bodies of Palestinians.
So,
Palestine Action is a group based in the UK, and now it has spread also around the world. But some British activists decided to kick Elbit out of there, and also other arms companies that they are working against. But specifically Elbit Systems, which is Israel's #1 arms manufacturer, privately owned company, by the way. They used to have 10 sites operating in the UK. Over the past 4 years, due to these ongoing direct actions, where we either block access to the factories or take over the rooftops, or sometimes go in and smash up the place. But due to these ongoing direct actions, 3 of these 10 sites have been permanently shut down. And that is
That's
quite impressive considering the forces that we are working against.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but at a very high cost to you, I think, with being put in prison for at least a month and all kinds of other personal costs. So it's incredible, all this activism that you and others have been doing as well.
Ronnie, let's talk about liberal Zionism, because even Zionists are finding what's going on unpalatable in many ways, finally, and they're starting to distance themselves from Israel. What are your thoughts on this shift, and what are liberal Zionists? What do you think? Do you think that's it's a viable idea?
So, for one thing, even Zionists are kind of starting to at least seek other places to live in. But that is not because they stop being Zionists, just because they don't like certain aspects of what's happening. And part of it is, if they are a liberal Zionist, then they don't like that right-wing fascist government. They want a so-called left-wing fascist government instead.
Still a fascist government.
Yes. Now, the two types of Zionism. I said that I only know two types. I've never come across a third option. One are the Zionists who are racist and proud of it, supremacists and proud of it. This is the acting government. But all along, basically, if we think about it, the only two real narratives are the Zionist narrative and the Palestinian narrative. The Zionist narrative that is about supremacy and exclusivity, and this is our land, and so on, and we will dictate. We are the masters of the land. And the Palestinians, who are basically the indigenous people who are currently under the boot of Zionism. But it's not that difficult to understand, just like the story wasn't that difficult to understand with slavery in the US. Yes, you had two narratives, the slaves and the slave owners. Under apartheid in South Africa, Nazism, fascism, and so on. It's very clear. But in between, another narrative kind of emerged, which is a very, very effective tool of Zionist propaganda, which is called liberal Zionism. The liberal supremacists, the smiling apartheid people. And those quote-unquote liberal Zionists, they speak a very different language. They are not proud of being racist and supremacist. They sugarcoat everything, and they speak about democratic values and human rights and so on. But they are still just as racist and supremacist. How does that work? If you read Haaretz newspaper, you will see it happening all the time, because I see Haaretz newspaper as the leading tool of Zionist propaganda, by far. The most effective tool of Zionist propaganda. Basically, okay, I said those who are racist and proud of it, you see, I mean, they are exposing their face, and it's very clear what is happening. Up until the 7th of October, I would argue that the Zionist propaganda of those liberal Zionists has been very, very effective. Since the 7th of October, there is a huge crack in that propaganda, because finally, because of just how horrible and unbearable the situation is, because we can see on our mobile phones exactly what is happening every day. And as you said, and they are even boasting about what they are doing. It's not only the victims that are documenting it, it is the perpetrators who are documenting their own crimes. Because of all of that, Zionism has finally, after many, many decades, has exposed its true face to the rest of the world. It was always that face. It was always a fascist state. It was never anything other than fascist. But now it is explicitly so, now it is proudly so, and even beyond fascist.
That's interesting because, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So I said that the fascist, clearly fascist and proud of it version, we know of that. This was clear. But what allowed Israel to carry on for such a long time, for 7 decades, at least, with acting the way it does, but having some clout of normality and legitimacy to a state that has no normality and zero legitimacy, okay, to a state that is an apartheid state from the get-go and on, is that clout that is given to it, that is offered by this liberal Zionist discourse. And the liberal Zionist discourse is very misleading because, for example, they speak about Israeli democracy. open Haaretz newspaper, you will see pretty much every article will say, oh, the downfall of Israeli democracy, fighting for democracy, blah, 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 democracy. There's not an iota of democracy. There can never be a democracy in a race state, by definition. They will speak about, obviously, the Jewish state, the Israeli left. They will speak about everything that we covered before, the occupation and the settlements, obviously meaning the occupation, the minor occupation of 67, the settlements of 67, which they see as the problem. They would point the finger at Netanyahu as being the problem. Because Netanyahu is less apologetic about what he stands for, and his allies are even less apologetic than he is. The liberal Zionists, they want to have their cherished race state. They want to have a state for us and only for us, but they use a different language. They want to come across as liberal and democratic. And that is the only reason why they support the two-state facade, the two-state solution, quote unquote. Why? Because the two states has nothing to do with the rights of Palestinians. It's all about having as many Palestinians over there and as few of them here with us. If we don't have two states, if we have one state where we are the masters of the land, we will no longer be able to claim that we are a democracy. So they have kept over half of all Palestinians in forced exile, but even inside Palestine, on that land, the demographic situation is about half-half, 50-50. And they are arriving at a situation where, even according to them, that they can no longer claim that they are democratic because they always play the number game. Actually, those liberal Zionists are even more racist in that sense than Netanyahu and Ben Gvir, because those liberal Zionists are so obsessed with demographics all the time. This is the only thing that bothers them, that they have to maintain this, to be just a little bit more than the other side.
But I think you're right, because if it's liberal Zionists or whether it's Likud, right, left, center, whatever, I mean, the continuous, over 90% of Israelis are supporting continuous genocide and ethnic cleansing and whatever. It's not the parties anymore. It's systematic. But Ronnie, if we know it's a racist ideology, it needs to be dismantled. How can this be achieved swiftly? Because it seems like, if anything, it's getting regressively worse and not better.
I am quite optimistic that we are finally seeing the end of Zionism. And again, referring to Ilan Pappé that I mentioned before, he is talking about it quite a bit over the past year and a half. Why so? Exactly because Zionism has finally exposed its true face to the world. Because there is no going back. When people look at Gaza, they cannot unsee it. It doesn't matter what excuse Israel will give. It is just impossible for them to justify it any longer. And it is also impossible to claim legitimacy, to claim legitimacy to the rest of the Zionist project any longer. Because, I mean, especially when we understand that the story of Gaza is actually just a continuation. What is happening in Gaza is a continuation of the same type of thinking. What is happening right now in Jenin and other parts of the West Bank is the continuation of the same type of thinking. Yeah. The whole wish for Zionists is to have an ethnically pure state by any means necessary. Now, they can argue between themselves about what are the necessary means. Okay, some want to have two states, and this is how they will separate between themselves and the others. Some want to ethnically cleanse everyone or just obliterate everyone. But this type of thinking has been totally exposed to the rest of the world, and it comes at a very, very high price, at the ultimate price, at the price of roughly 300,000 people that have been killed, and we don't know what else is in store. These are really, really dark times, but the one positive thing, the one kind of possible light at the end of the tunnel is that finally I can say that Zionism is in its final days, because they are so brazen about it, because they are so explicit about just how racist and monstrous and Nazi they are.
So tell us then about your involvement with the upcoming Jewish Anti-Zionist Congress. What does that stand for? I guess it's similar to what you've been saying, but what is the scope of that?
So this is something that needed to happen long ago, and some of us have been working on having some sort of a congress like this a while back, but it didn't materialize, and hopefully it will be happening very soon. Everyone is invited on the 13th of June for a weekend in Vienna, Austria, for the first Anti-Zionist Congress. It was the first Zionist Congress almost like 128 years ago, and now we want to have an anti-Zionist Congress. Now, it is not about what one's self-identification is, Jewish or not Jewish. I said I don't consider myself Jewish, but rather it is all of those different people who the Zionist state claims to speak on our behalf, standing up against Zionism and opening a clear, unwavering front against Zionism. Basically, calling out a declaration of war against Zionism. And obviously there will be Palestinian voices there and many other non-Jews, but the whole idea is to have something that comes from those that the Zionist state claims to speak on our behalf, and especially now, especially during a genocide, this is what is clearly needed, a clear, unequivocal call to negate any and all legitimacy, and to basically to declare war on Zionism and the Zionist state.
Yeah.
Now, I mentioned that we see around the world that the fascist forces are uniting. It has been happening over the past decades, but we see with Trump's recent actions, with Germany's and others, also in the UK, the fascist forces are uniting. It is time also for the anti-fascist forces to unite. And the worse that things become, the more it forces us actually to stand up against that. Okay, so it is really, it is either now or never. So also in that context, I think that having such a Jewish anti-Zionist Congress is important.
Yeah. Another question for you on that note. Despite this Zionist propaganda, people in the global south, which is really the global majority, are finally learning a lot more about Palestine. It sort of dipped out of the news after so many years of oppression. And we're seeing a growing number of Jewish people in the West speaking out and distancing from the Zionist project. How can anti-Zionist Jewish communities, of whom there are growing numbers, as we say, influence this discourse globally? You've talked about the Congress. Is there anything, because there are a lot of Jewish people who are horrified by what's going on, who don't want this associated with Judaism. How can they help the support for anti-Zionism and Palestinian liberation?
So first of all, as far as Judaism goes, I negate any and all conflation of Judaism and Zionism.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there's absolutely no connection between the two. We discussed some of it in the past, earlier, and I think that is kind of should be the first approach. Any and all conflation should be rejected. Actually, any and all conflation is racist in itself. Even just the logic of it, saying that whenever an Israeli representative says that if one is critical of that Zionist race state, they must also be somehow anti-Jewish, what they call anti-Semitic, the very logic of that statement also means the opposite. It also means that if someone is Jewish because of whatever, they must also be inherently, because of their Jewishness, also supportive of that criminal apartheid race state.
Yeah.
So it's just like saying all Muslims are terrorists, all Jews are, Zionist, horrible people. Okay. So that is a very racist thing. And in general, whenever we treat a group of people as a monolithic group, especially because of I don't know, their religion or ethnicity or so on, that is racism. So we have to reject all of that. Secondly, I think that it is encouraging to see how many people who grew up in Zionist homes especially in North America and so on, are now kind of distancing themselves from Zionism and the Zionist state. And that is very encouraging. We saw over the past decade and more how JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, has grown tremendously in numbers. I also know that initially they were supporting BDS, but implicitly and not explicitly. And then their own constituents, like their own people, they said, no, we have to make it clear. We have to be explicit about it. So there was a demand to be even more upfront about that and be more clear about where they stand. Later on, they also published a clear statement against Zionism. So all of these things are very important, to have these very clear messages, clear understanding where we stand, and be unashamed about standing up to Zionism, fascism, and Nazism. Another thing is also, specifically as a privileged Israeli Jew and so on. First of all, I have to acknowledge my privilege and use my privilege as much as I can to speak up and to change the situation. I mean, I know that if I would have been Palestinian, I would have been either in prison or dead by now, doing things that I did in Palestine. I mean, even crossing checkpoints and things like that, disregarding checkpoints and things like that. I mean, I've had, guns aimed at me and so on, but they never shot because, and if I was a different person, I would have been. But also just about speaking up. I don't care if there's some, I don't know, some element tries to smear me, either by calling me an anti-Semite or whatever, all kinds of things. I'm used to being smeared. I'm used to being shadow banned. I'm used to all these things. Okay, I mean, if the fact that it happens, it only means that our voice matters. So we have to carry on speaking up.
Yeah, no, I love that.
Yeah, and finally, also, with a little bit of an optimistic view into the future, we also have to sow the seeds for something better and more sane for the future. Something that respects the rights of everyone, something that is based on equality and, everything that the Zionist state is opposed to: equality and multiculturalism and rights of minorities, and and respecting the rights of everyone.
Yeah, no, I agree. That was my next thing, was because as we established, Zionism is a racist, ethno-supremacist ideology. So for me, the only solution is a single democratic, decolonized state from the river to the sea, with equal rights for all, justice, reparation, right of return of all Palestinians, which we establish is recognized under international law. But Ronnie, what is your vision for a just solution, and when do you think it can be achieved? I know you said Zionism is beginning to disintegrate, but what's the vision for the future? Because we've had some people still say two states, which I don't know. Some talk about all sorts of cantons and all kinds of other solutions. But I'd love to know what's your vision for that kind of just long-lasting solution.
Yeah, so definitely I am also part of the one state group, and there will also be another conference about one state in June where I was invited to speak, and I would invite you to that as well. But even before talking about one state, the things that we can do now, I mean, there are two things in general that need to be done in the short term and in the long term. In the short term, we have to abolish the crime. And the list of crimes is just endless pretty much by now. In the long term, we actually have to build something together. So BDS, for example, is a way to try to stop the crime. Successful to a certain degree. I think that now things are on another level. I say that in good days we have civil disobedience, but civil disobedience is not relevant now. Now what we need is at the very least direct action. Okay, so that's why I took part with Palestine Action. Actually, I took part in two actions. Also, another one that was a year before the Bristol headquarters, and I will have a trial about that next month in the UK. But in any case, direct action is something that every one of us can do. And it doesn't necessarily even have to be illegal. Okay, not everyone has to go and smash up an arms factory, even though should be considered. But but for example, going to disrupt a city council meeting, it's not illegal to raise our voices. It's not illegal to go and demand certain things, to have sit-ins in different places, to disrupt that, you know, that ongoing war machine, where unfortunately most of the viewers are their government is fully complicit in that. Actually, the only ones who have actually took a stand, a clear stand, is Yemen, one of the poorest countries in the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so I think that every one of us can do something to demand a change from our elected officials, from whoever it is, and it's important to be focused, and it's important not to have a one-off action. Like what I learned from Palestine Action is that it is very important to be focused, to have a clear target. It is very important also to have ongoing actions, to have something that's happening over and over and over again. That's how we achieve something.
Yeah.
Okay, and it's amazing to see that it doesn't matter how repressive the authorities are and how they are now arresting people under all kinds of like terrorism act and things like that, and people are held behind bars for months, even before trial, in harsh conditions. Still, more and more and more people want to join all the time, because, as I said, when the situation becomes so dire, there is a need to take action. Now, how does each one of us take action? Okay, it is open for evaluation and discussion. Not everyone can afford risking their liberty and so on, but everyone can do something. So I would encourage every one of the viewers to think about what they can do. And regardless, go to Palestine Action and register and take some webinar or some direct action kind of training. That is always useful and maybe inspirational. And then, other than what we have to do right now to stop the crimes, and another thing is also there are all these legal procedures that are happening, including versus the ICC and so on. Israel, at the same time, is legislating a new law now saying that any Israeli citizen like myself who may assist the International Tribunal will end up in prison for 5 years to life. This is how Israel is responding.
Yeah. Well, it is usually extreme. Fascism becomes more extreme as it sees its end coming.
Yes.
And I was just going to ask you what you think all the people listening to this podcast, ordinary people who want to make a difference, can do. And I think you answered it very well there. And just to recap, go to Palestine Action, sign up, see if there's anything there that if you're listening to this, that you could help with. But I found that was a very inspiring end. Thank you, Ronnie.
Is there any other message or anything you want to leave the audience with before we wrap? I think you've given excellent points.
So I will say finally one more thing about one state. Personally, I'm in favor of less than one, but one is a good enough compromise. Why is one state different than 2 states or 5 states or 51 states? By the way, when I first visited in the US, I told a friend, Rania, that I'm coming to visit the mainland. I'm coming from the basically 51st state of the US.
Oh.
Which is,
I'm in Canada right now.
feels.
We're both let's not make that joke. We're not
But in any case, why is one state in the one state discourse different? Because it doesn't fall into that trap of talking about demographics. It's not about demography, it's about democracy. It's about demanding the rights of everyone. And it's a demand. It's the underlying principle is that respect of all of the rights of everyone, and personal and collective rights. And I think that this is also a way forward. And I hope for the day that, and some small some small actions are taking place in that context of, as I said, sowing the seeds, thinking about starting to build to write a constitution, for example, that we said that there is no constitution, but there will be a constitution in that future, whatever it is, that will have whatever name.
Yeah.
And these things are even just that discussion of seeing our future life together is a very, very important discussion to have, to break physical and mental barriers. And given that there is a genocide happening, it is becoming much more difficult, maybe less realistic, but we still have to talk about it.
And I love what you're doing in Germany, in Austria, sort of the Jewish Anti-Zionist Congress. I think that's brilliant.
No.
I hope people will join you for that. Sorry,
Please.
Shamim.
Thank you.
Yes, I know. I hope so indeed. I know it's been really enlightening, energizing, and inspiring, Ronnie. So as we wrap up, thank you so much again for joining us today. And I want to say thank you to our listeners. And just to remind you, if you're listening to this or watching it, if you enjoyed this episode, please take a second to just hit the like button, to share, to subscribe, because that kind of engagement really helps us to amplify voices that are grounded in humanism, which is an important thing. Ronnie, I know we are wondering what it means to be human these days, but it's very important in an AI world and in a fascist world to hang on to the elements of humanity that we all know and we all aspire to. Ronnie, thank you again. Your insights were really invaluable, and your dedication to the Palestinian cause, to the human cause, is really very inspiring. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And just to say, stories and representation matter. Stay informed, stay engaged. Above all, take action. As Ronnie said, that now is the time to take action. Collective power is the only way. And in solidarity, see you next time. And shukran, Ronnie. Thank you for your courage, for speaking out, taking action, and for all that you do for Palestine. We need more people like you.